Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own family's story? I spent 26 years perfecting the art of being invisible, watching my parents celebrate my brother Marcus's every breath while treating my existence like an inconvenient afterthought. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in March 2020, with my phone buzzing insistently against my nightstand in my small studio apartment in Hartford. "Kaia, we need to discuss the Greenwich property." My father's voice carried that familiar tone of barely contained irritation, as if my very presence on the phone line was disrupting something more important. "Your mother and I have decided it's time to sell the family house. Marcos will handle the details with the realtor since he's the one with business experience." The dismissal stung with practiced efficiency. 26 years of computer science degrees, software engineering promotions, and $95,000 salaries apparently meant nothing compared to Marcus's MBA and his habit of calling our parents every Sunday. I pressed my face against the cool glass of my apartment window, watching early morning joggers navigate the empty Hartford streets while my father continued outlining plans that apparently didn't require my input. The house in question sat on 3 acres of pristine Connecticut coastline, a sprawling colonial that had belonged to our family for generations. I'd spent countless summers there as a child, building sandcastles while Marcus played tennis at the country club, reading books in the library while he entertained friends by the pool. Even then, the house felt more like a museum I was allowed to visit than a home where I belonged. "The market's perfect right now," Dad continued, his words clipping through the phone with businessman precision. "Pre-pandemic prices are still holding strong. Marcus thinks we can get at least $2.8 million, maybe $3 if we stage it properly. We'll split everything fairly between you kids, of course." His definition of fair had always been fascinating. Fair was Marcus getting the master bedroom during family visits while I slept on the pull-out sofa. Fair was family photos that somehow always featured Marcus prominently while I lingered on the edges. Fair was college tuition paid in full for his private school, while I worked 3 jobs to cover my state university expenses. That morning, something inside me finally cracked. Maybe it was the casual way he'd excluded me from decisions about property that supposedly belonged to all of us. Maybe it was the assumption that Marcus would naturally take the lead because he was the son, the heir, the one who mattered. "I'd like to be involved in the process," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I can take time off work to meet with realtors, handle some of the logistics." The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. "That's really not necessary, Kaia. Marcus has everything under control. You know how busy you are with your little computer projects." Little computer projects. I managed cybersecurity infrastructure for a fintech company that processed millions of dollars in transactions daily, but somehow that translated to little computer projects in my father's vocabulary. "Besides, you've never shown much interest in family business before." The accusation landed exactly where he intended. I'd never shown interest because I'd never been invited to show interest. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen nursing lukewarm coffee and staring at my laptop screen. My morning routine usually involved checking market reports and system diagnostics, but that day I found myself Googling Greenwich, Connecticut real estate and scrolling through listings of multi-million-dollar properties. Houses with manicured lawns and circular driveways, homes where families probably gathered for holidays without anyone feeling like an intruder. I bookmarked a few local real estate agencies, telling myself I was just being thorough. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dad told me about the house sale." Don't worry about any of the details, sis. I've got it handled. Might be good for you to focus on your work stuff anyway. Even his reassurance felt like dismissal. I screenshot the message, though I wasn't sure why. Some instinct for documentation that would prove crucial later. The Greenwich house held every childhood memory I'd tried to reframe into something warmer than they actually were. Birthday parties where the spotlight never quite reached me, Christmas mornings where Marcus's pile of presents towered over my modest stack, family dinners where conversations flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture. But it was still the closest thing to a family legacy I had, and the idea of being excluded from its sale felt like being erased from our history entirely. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting my designated role as the grateful recipient of whatever Marcus decided was fair, I would involve myself in this process whether they wanted me there or not. I deserved to have a voice in decisions about my family's property, even if that family had never quite figured out how to make space for me at their table. The next morning, I called Pemberton and Associates Real Estate, one of Greenwich's most established firms. I'd like to schedule a consultation about selling a family property, I told the receptionist, my voice carrying a confidence I didn't entirely feel. When she asked for the address, I recited the Meadow Lane number that had been burned into my memory since childhood. "Oh, the Johnson property," she said immediately. "That's one of our premier coastal listings. Let me connect you with Sandra Pemberton herself." Sandra's voice carried the polished warmth of someone who dealt exclusively with multi-million-dollar properties. "I've actually been expecting a call about your family's house," she said, which struck me as odd. "We've had several inquiries over the years from potential buyers. It's quite a remarkable property. When would you like to schedule a walkthrough?" I suggested the following afternoon, making sure to mention that I'd be representing the family's interests in the sale process. What I didn't tell her was that I hadn't informed my parents or Marcus about this meeting. Some instinct told me I needed to understand the full scope of this property before my family's version of fair got applied to the situation. I took a personal day from work and drove the hour from Hartford to Greenwich, passing through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until I reached the familiar stone gates of our family property. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but no less imposing. 3 stories of weathered shingle and stone, surrounded by gardens that had been professionally maintained even during the years when we rarely visited. The circular driveway wound past perfectly pruned hedges toward a front door that still displayed the same brass knocker my great-grandmother had installed in 1952. I sat in my Honda Civic for several minutes, feeling like an imposter about to tour a home I supposedly belonged to. Sandra Pemberton arrived in a gleaming Mercedes SUV, her silver hair styled in the kind of elegant bob that probably required weekly maintenance appointments. She wore a cream blazer and carried a leather portfolio that looked more expensive than my monthly rent. "Kaia Johnson," she asked, extending a manicured hand. "You look just like your grandmother Martha. She was such a lovely woman." I'd never heard anyone describe Grandmother Martha as lovely. Intimidating, elegant, occasionally terrifying, but never lovely. "I'm curious," Sandra said as she unlocked the front door with a key I'd never seen before. "Have you been involved in managing the property over the years? The maintenance records show very consistent upkeep, which is unusual for a vacation home." I explained that my parents had handled all the property management, though I realized I'd never actually seen bills or contracts or any evidence of who was paying for the gardening service or the housekeeping or the quarterly pest control. Walking through rooms I'd known since childhood felt surreal. The living room with its stone fireplace where Marcus had always claimed the best spot during family movies. The kitchen with marble countertops where my mother had prepared elaborate meals for holiday gatherings that somehow never quite included my favorite foods. The library where I'd spent countless hours reading while the rest of the family socialized on the terrace. Every space held memories of feeling peripheral, but today something felt different about my presence here. The property includes the main house, the guest cottage, and the private beach access, Sandra explained, leading me toward rooms I'd rarely been allowed to explore, unsupervised as a child. The guest cottage has been completely renovated and could easily serve as a separate income property. The beach rights alone are worth a premium in this market. She showed me financial projections that made my salary look modest. Conservative estimates suggested the property could sell for $3.5 million, with potential for much higher offers depending on market conditions. Then, Sandra opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Now, I do need to clarify something before we proceed with listing preparations, she said, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. The ownership structure of this property is a bit more complex than typical family situations. Based on our records and the legal documents we have on file, I need to confirm who has the authority to make decisions about the sale. My stomach dropped. Complex ownership structure, legal documents. I'd assumed the house belonged jointly to my parents, with inheritance rights that would eventually pass to Marcus and me. I'm not sure I understand, I said, though something cold was beginning to form in my chest. Sandra flipped through several pages before finding what she was looking for. According to the deed transfer that was filed in 2018, this property is owned exclusively by... She paused, double-checking the document. Kaia Johnson. That would be you, wouldn't it? The world tilted sideways. I gripped the marble countertop to steady myself while Sandra's words echoed in my head. The house belonged to me, not to my parents, not jointly to Marcus and me. To me, exclusively, according to legal documents I'd never seen and a deed transfer I'd never authorized. I think there's been some mistake, I managed to say, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Sandra's expression softened with what looked like genuine concern as she spread the documents across the marble countertop. The deed transfer bore my signature, but I had absolutely no memory of ever signing such a document. This was processed through Whitman and Associates Legal Services in 2018, Sandra explained, pointing to the notary stamp and official seals. The previous owner, Martha Elizabeth Johnson, transferred full ownership to you just 3 months before her death. It's all completely legitimate, though I understand this might be surprising if no one explained the legal implications to you at the time. Grandmother Martha, the woman who'd barely acknowledged my existence during family gatherings, who'd always made it clear that Marcus was the heir apparent, had left me her most valuable asset. I photographed every document with shaking hands, my mind racing through memories of 2018. Grandmother Martha's funeral that fall, where I'd stood at the back while Marcus delivered a eulogy about family legacy and tradition. The will reading where she'd left him her jewelry and antique collection, while I received what everyone described as sentimental items, old books and photo albums that seemed like consolation prizes. No one had mentioned real estate transfers or property ownership or $3.5 million inheritances. Sandra, I need to ask you something in complete confidence, I said, my voice steadier now. Have my parents or my brother contacted you about selling this property? She nodded immediately. Your father called last week asking about market conditions and listing timelines. He seemed very familiar with the property details and mentioned that the family was ready to move forward with a sale. My father, who apparently knew exactly how valuable this house was, but had somehow forgotten to mention that I was the legal owner. The drive back to Hartford passed in a blur of Connecticut countryside and racing thoughts. I called in sick for the rest of the week, which wasn't entirely dishonest since I felt physically ill every time I considered the implications of what I'd discovered. My family had been planning to sell my property without my knowledge, assuming I'd be grateful for whatever percentage they decided to give me from the proceeds. I spent the next 3 days conducting my own investigation. The Whitman and Associates website showed they specialized in estate planning and property transfers for high net worth families. When I called their offices, the receptionist immediately pulled up my file. "Oh yes, the Johnson estate transfer," she said cheerfully. "That was one of our more complex cases, given the specific conditions Mrs. Johnson attached to the property transfer. Conditions I'd never been told about. The legal secretary, Mrs. Chen, agreed to meet with me that Friday afternoon. Her office in downtown Hartford smelled like leather and old paper, the walls lined with law books and framed diplomas. "Your grandmother was very specific about her intentions," she explained, pulling out a thick file folder. "She wanted to ensure the family property would be protected for future generations, and she believed you were the most responsible choice for stewardship, Mrs. Chen showed me copies of correspondence between my grandmother and the law firm dating back to 2017. In her own handwriting, Martha Johnson had detailed her concerns about her son's financial management and her eldest grandson's tendency toward impulsive decisions. She felt strongly that Kaia had demonstrated the most stability and long-term thinking among the family members, one letter read. Her career in technology shows patience and strategic planning that will serve the property well. The documents revealed conditions I'd never known existed. I was required to maintain the property for a minimum of 5 years before any sale could be considered. If I chose to sell, I had the right to make all decisions about timing, pricing, and distribution of proceeds. Most importantly, the transfer had been structured to minimize tax implications for me while maximizing the benefit to future generations of our family. Your grandmother specifically requested that the transfer not be discussed with other family members until you reached 25, Mrs. Chen explained. She felt you needed time to establish your career and gain confidence before dealing with family pressure about the inheritance. 25. I turned 26 last December, which meant this secret had been waiting for me for over a year. The final revelation knocked the breath out of me entirely. Grandmother Martha had also established a maintenance trust fund that had been covering all property expenses for the past 2 years. Gardening, utilities, property taxes, insurance, everything my parents claimed to be managing had actually been handled by a trust fund set up specifically for my benefit. The account currently held over $40,000 in unused funds. I drove to the Greenwich house that Saturday morning, parking in the circular driveway like I had every right to be there, because I did have every right to be there. This was my property, my inheritance, my decision to make. The weight of that realization felt both terrifying and liberating. Sunday dinner at my parents' house in West Hartford had always been a weekly ritual I endured rather than enjoyed, but that particular Sunday in late March felt different. I sat at their dining room table, the same spot I'd occupied for 26 years, watching my mother serve Marcus larger portions while my father outlined his plans for the Greenwich property sale. The irony was almost suffocating. "I've been thinking we should price it aggressively," Dad said, cutting into his roast beef with the same precision he applied to business decisions. "Marcus ran some comps, and we could probably get 3.2 if we're patient, maybe 3.4 with the right buyer." Marcus nodded importantly, as if his weekend of browsing Zillow had made him a real estate expert. "The market's still strong despite all this pandemic uncertainty. We should move fast." I set down my fork and took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. "Actually, I need to tell you something about the Greenwich house." The conversation stopped. My mother looked up from her plate with the expression she usually reserved for minor household disasters, while Marcus continued chewing with the confidence of someone who'd never been contradicted about property decisions. "I met with Sandra Pemberton at Pemberton and Associates this week," I continued, my voice steadier than my hands. "She showed me some interesting documents about the property ownership." My father's face shifted into the familiar mask of barely contained irritation he wore whenever I overstepped my designated role in family discussions. "Kaia, we already told you Marcus is handling the realtor meetings," Mom said, her voice carrying that tone of gentle correction she'd perfected over decades of managing family dynamics. "You don't need to worry about the details." Kinsiri, and the assumption that I was incapable of handling details about my own property would have been laughable if it weren't so perfectly representative of our family dynamic. "The thing is," I said, pulling out photocopies of the deed transfer and trust documents, "I own the house completely. Grandmother Martha transferred the entire property to me in 2018, 3 months before she died. I have all the legal documentation right here." I spread the papers across the dining room table, watching my family's expressions shift from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic. The silence stretched until Marcus finally spoke. "That's impossible. Grandmother always talked about the house staying in the family. She wouldn't have just given it to—" He stopped himself before saying something we'd all regret, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "She wouldn't have given it to the daughter who didn't matter, the granddaughter who'd never been the favorite, the family member who'd always been peripheral to their important decisions." My father's reaction was more controlled but equally telling. He examined the documents with the careful attention he usually reserved for business contracts, his face growing more serious with each page. "These look legitimate," he admitted finally, though his tone suggested he was hoping to find some loophole or technical error. "But surely there's some requirement for family consultation on major decisions like selling." "Actually, no," I said, referencing the legal summary Mrs. Chen had prepared for me. "The property is mine to manage as I see fit, including all decisions about maintenance, improvements, and potential sale." I watched my father's jaw tighten as the full implications became clear. For the first time in my life, I held something he couldn't control or influence or give to Marcus instead. My mother's response was perhaps the most revealing. "Honey, this is such a big responsibility," she said, her voice full of the concern she'd never shown when I was handling complex cybersecurity projects or managing 6-figure budgets at work. "Maybe we should all work together to figure out the best approach. Family property is so complicated and you're still so young." 26 was apparently too young to manage real estate, but old enough to be excluded from family financial decisions. Marcus had been unusually quiet, but finally he put down his fork and looked directly at me. "So, what are you planning to do?" The question carried undertones of accusation, as if my ownership of the property was somehow a betrayal of family expectations rather than a gift from our grandmother. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. I need time to think about what Grandmother Martha would have wanted and what makes the most sense for my future. The phrase, my future, seemed to land like a physical blow around the table. For 26 years, my future had been something they'd planned around rather than with me. My father recovered first, switching to his negotiation voice. Of course, you'll want to consider what's best for the family as a whole, he said, his tone suggesting that my individual ownership was merely a technicality that shouldn't interfere with their collective plans. The property has been a family asset for generations. It would be a shame to see that tradition disrupted by legal technicalities. I folded the documents and put them back in my folder, standing up from the dinner table with a sense of finality. It's not a legal technicality, Dad. It's my inheritance. And for the first time in my life, I get to make decisions about something that actually belongs to me. The drive home felt like traveling through different weather systems, from the storm of family disapproval to the calm of my own space where I could think without managing everyone else's expectations. 2 years later, I'm writing this from the sunroom of my Greenwich house, my house, watching the afternoon light dance across Long Island Sound. The guest cottage has been converted into my home office, where I now run my own cybersecurity consulting firm. The property that my family wanted to sell for quick cash has become the foundation for building wealth I never imagined possible. The months following that Sunday dinner revelation weren't easy. My family cycled through stages of grief about losing control over what they'd assumed was their asset. First came denial, with my father repeatedly suggesting that I must have misunderstood the legal documents. Then anger, with Marcus accusing me of manipulating Grandmother Martha in her final years, despite the fact that I'd barely spoken to her during that time. Bargaining followed, with various proposals about how I could share the property decision-making with the family who had expertise I supposedly lacked. But something remarkable happened during those difficult conversations. For the first time in my life, I held firm ground that couldn't be redistributed or reinterpreted or given to someone else. The property belonged to me legally, financially, and emotionally in ways that couldn't be negotiated away. And slowly, I began to understand why Grandmother Martha had structured her gift this way. The maintenance trust fund she'd established had been more generous than anyone realized. Beyond covering property expenses, it had accumulated enough surplus to fund significant improvements. I hired local contractors to renovate the guest cottage into a professional workspace, complete with the kind of high-speed internet infrastructure and security systems that attracted corporate clients willing to pay premium rates for in-person cybersecurity consultations. My parents eventually reached acceptance, though it took nearly a year and several difficult conversations about family dynamics and years of feeling invisible. My mother admitted she'd never realized how often they'd excluded me from important discussions, while my father acknowledged that his assumptions about Marcus being the natural heir had been unfair to both his children. These weren't easy conversations, but they were necessary ones. Marcus took longer to adjust. His sense of entitlement to family assets had been so ingrained that my ownership felt like theft to him initially. But when I offered him a consulting role in managing some of the property improvements, he gradually began to see my success as something that could benefit the entire family rather than diminish his own prospects. Last month, he helped me negotiate a deal with a tech startup that wanted to film a commercial on the property, generating rental income that none of us had considered. The house itself has become something I never expected, a place where I actually belong. Instead of feeling like a visitor in a family museum, I wake up each morning in a bedroom I chose and decorated myself. I host Thanksgiving dinners where everyone gets equal portions and equal attention. I filled the library with books I actually want to read, and I've turned the formal living room into a comfortable space where real conversations happen instead of performance pieces about family status. My consulting business has grown beyond anything I imagined possible when I was driving back and forth from Hartford to attend meetings in borrowed conference rooms. Clients fly in from across the country to work with me in an environment that feels both professional and welcoming. The combination of technical expertise and elegant surroundings has created a niche market that's both profitable and personally satisfying. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned the difference between being included in family financial decisions and making my own financial decisions. The property's value has increased to over $4 million, but more than that, it's generated income streams I wouldn't have discovered if we'd rushed into a quick sale. The guest cottage rental, the location fees, the consulting business, all revenue sources that emerged because I had time and space to think strategically rather than react to family pressure. When people ask me about inheriting property unexpectedly, I tell them it's not really about the money or even the real estate. It's about discovering you have value that someone recognized, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Grandmother Martha saw something in me that my own family had overlooked: the capacity for long-term thinking, the willingness to maintain something valuable rather than liquidate it immediately, the potential to build something meaningful rather than just manage someone else's vision. The family dynamics aren't perfect now, but they're honest in ways they never were before. When you stop waiting for other people to make space for you at their table, you can build your own table and invite exactly who you want to share it. What gift will you finally give yourself when you stop waiting for someone else's permission to claim what's already yours?